Our next presenter is Thomas. Thomas has been with Salesforce for 8 years, building developer tools. He writes, although historically a Java developer, he is a JavaScript, Node, and beer enthusiast. He currently lives in Denver with his wife and his 6-month-old daughter. So give a hand for Thomas.
Hey guys, how's it going? Yeah, super excited to be here. Salesforce has kind of been, building a CLI for the last 3 years. And so I just kind of want to talk about the way we think about CLIs in terms of the values that Salesforce has, which I'm calling enterprise grade. So there's my email on Twitter and GitHub handler. Please follow me or reach out to me, talk to me here. I love chatting with all you guys. This is a very Salesforce slide. Doesn't really relate to any of you guys. Just don't purchase Salesforce based on what I'm talking about here, which I don't think you will. All right. So I want to start with just kind of talking about the definition of enterprise, right? Everyone has a different opinion about it. You can look at a million different definitions online. So at the basic level, it's just a company, right, or a business. But I want to get a little bit more detailed about that so we can talk about what I mean by enterprise grade. So really, kind of a really, really big company, right? Probably a small startup will have some different values than a company like Salesforce or something like that. For profit, obviously. And then also, what I'm referring to is more business to business. I think companies who do B2B versus B2C will have different trust concerns. And so when a whole company is running on another company's software, it makes you think about trust in a different way. So what is enterprise grade? Based on what the definition of enterprise is, it's really about trust, right? What are your trust with your customers? And so at Salesforce, we have a lot of trust values, but I'm going to talk about 4 and how we kind of integrated those into our idea of a CLI. So really the first one is security. You really have to make sure you protect your customer's data, you protect your customer, just whatever it may be that you're dealing with. Performance, obviously if a company is building on top of your thing, they need to move fast too. So you got to make sure you do some sort of performance gains there. Reliability, right? This is not only really uptime, but I'm also considering this as part of delivery as well, right? So as a company, another company has to rely on when you're going to release and what does that release schedule look like and things like that. To prepare for it or to train their employees on the new things that you're doing, which can be a very expensive thing. And then last is kind of what I'm talking about, standardization. This is really about that really, really big that I talked about. When you have a huge organization all developing software, things can get kind of disjointed, right? So you want to make sure that all of your CLI commands, for example, feel like they were written by one company and not a whole bunch of different teams, which is very easy to get in that pitfall. So let's just talk about some different data about Salesforce. Now, every enterprise, I think Salesforce is actually not even that big of an enterprise, but this is some things that relate to Salesforce. So anyone guess what 150,000 is? Any guesses? Yeah. So this is actually customers. This is the amount of businesses that run off of Salesforce. So pretty big number, pretty cool. Users is way more than this, but there's just the amount of companies that run on it. How about 70 billion? That's a big number.
Transactions?
Yeah, and actually specifically Apex transactions. If you don't know what Apex is, it's a programming language that runs on the Salesforce platform. And just in Apex transactions alone every day. So really big number, really big scale. Kind of give you an idea of some things at Salesforce. How about 9 million? Now we're getting into the realm of the CLI, if that gives any hints. Well, wow, that'd be awesome if it was downloads. So this is actually the number of commands executed since we've started developing the CLI. So what do you think, that's big or small? I think it's actually a pretty cool number. It kind of shows. We also only collect analytics every 24 hours. So any CI jobs that spin up a new dyno, run a bunch of commands, and then tear back down, we're actually not even incorporating those usage stats here. 16,000? Any guesses? No? Oh, no? So this is actually CLI users. Again, maybe big or small. I think we have about we have a few thousand daily active users, but yeah, 16,000 overall unique users who use it, so can be considered downloads too. But yeah, pretty cool number. And then 90, this is small, but I think this is actually one of the coolest numbers of everything I'm talking about here. Any ideas? No? Although we actually have a lot more than 90 commands. Contributors now. So this is actually plugins. I think this is a really cool number because it kind of shows that what we're doing with the Salesforce CLI is building a kind of a CLI ecosystem, right? About 10 of these or so are internal plugins, and about the other 80 are community ones. You know, some of them are crazy, crazy small. I think probably only a handful of the community ones are widely used by a lot of our Salesforce users. But the fact that people are taking their time to build a plugin, even if it's one command, and publishing it to NPM is pretty cool, right? So numbers I think that are really, really neat. Before I get into the trust values, I just kind of want to give a little bit of history. You know, Jeff Dickey kind of mentioned a little bit about the Heroku CLI and oclif basically forking or like evolving from their experience. And the Salesforce CLI has been on that journey with them. So about in 2005, we decided to do this initiative called Salesforce DX, which is, you know, developer experience. And part of that was developing a CLI. So during that year, we went back and forth between being a Heroku plugin, so being part of the Heroku CLI, or using Args, which is just that JavaScript, you know, argument parsing library that's out there. And so this is what we were calling the tool belt, which was our plugin. And this is where the majority of our commands live in. And so as we kind of went back and forth going in that, we eventually decided to be a Heroku plugin, and then, you know, the powers that be, very political issue, it was decided that we needed our own executable name. So instead of typing Heroku whatever, they want to type SFDX whatever. Because a lot of the Heroku users didn't really understand Salesforce, and a lot of Salesforce users didn't really understand Heroku. So it needed to be separate. And so this is when we became part of the Heroku CLI repo. At that point, it was called V5. It was in Golang. And we were a branch that changed the executable name, but otherwise everything else was the same. The build code, all that was the same. And then because we had a lot more requirements, Heroku, what they did was they broke out the core engine of that into V6, which was all JavaScript, because there were some problems with doing, or not problems, but some inconveniences of going between Go and the JavaScript plugins. And so this was when we broke out into our own repo, which was, you had the Heroku CLI, the Salesforce CLI, all built on top of the CLI engine. And then eventually that evolved into oclif. So we kind of went on this whole journey. We had a lot of legacy code in there. It took us, I don't know, probably close to a year to move everything over to oclif. So it took us a long time, a lot of pain points there. I'm not going to get into it. If you guys are curious, you can talk to me afterwards. But let's get into some of the trust values. First, I'm going to start off with security. Pretty much all of our commands interact with a Salesforce org. And so to do that, you need a connection to that org. So when you're doing OAuth inside of the CLI, you have to store those credentials down on the machine, and you have to get those credentials from somewhere, right? So we use both web login using OAuth and both JWT headless. We build in a lot of additional of the security features of OAuth, such as doing a state verification on the request. So that way, if anyone tried to pick up that process request on a different user or something, they couldn't actually get the auth code or the token from the server. So again, always thinking about these different attack vectors when you're connecting to a service, right? Local encryption, so all tokens and all secrets are encrypted on the machine. We broke this out into a library so that encryption is done the same way across all plugins. We do use OS-specific credential vaults like Keychain on Mac, libsecret on Linux. We used to be part of the credential manager or whatever on Windows, but it's kind of a pain to work with, and it required PowerShell, and we want to get rid of PowerShell. So now we fall back to like an SSH style encryption. If you guys are not currently encrypting things on the machine, you should be. So again, if you're curious about that, talk to me. Plugin signing is a big one for us. Now, a lot of Salesforce is unique in the fact that a lot of users may not be traditional developers. And so we get like a lot of admins or admin/devs who want to participate in the CLI, and they may not understand what it means to run a command on the command line. any command that's run on the command line has full user permission, right? So even if we encrypt these values on the machine, if they have user access, they can still uncrypt it. And so now that we have over 80 community plugins out there, we want customers to understand when they install this plugin, it is something that is part of the community and something that we don't control. So they are running code that, again, we don't know, we don't trust. And so we do what we call plugin signing, where if a user types in plugins install, and it's a plugin that is not signed by Salesforce, we will prompt up a warning saying, we don't know what this plugin is, we don't trust it, so make sure you know what you're doing by installing it. And this is kind of one of the ways we're starting to enforce trust on plugins. I can talk to more about plugin signing down the road and how we actually do that if you guys are curious. I'm not going to get too much into it here. And then security code review. So this is all the internally plugins that we sign. Any plugin that we sign, we make sure goes through code review with our security teams. We also actively monitor, obviously, all the NPM dependencies that we have. So when security vulnerabilities come out, we require that they're updated if they're going to stay as part of the core Salesforce plugin list. Now I want to talk a little bit about CLI hooks. If you guys haven't used oclif hooks, they're awesome. It's not only a good way for people who are building on top of your CLI to integrate with the execution flow, but also for you to interact with oclif's execution flow. So oclif has a plugins pre-install hook, and this is where we hook in so that we can verify the plugin before we actually install it. One of the things with oclif hooks is that they all run in parallel, and they're undeterministic. And so when we do multiple things on plugin pre-install, and we need those things to happen serially and deterministically, so that way the user output is consistent, and we want to check versions of old plugins that we no longer support before we actually do the plugin signing. So in order to get it into a deterministic serial flow, what we do is we actually fire multiple events. So the top here is where we're registering for the plugins pre-install hook, and then that bottom code, you'll see that we're actually firing off 2 more events, right? These are 2 more hooks that other plugins somewhere else that are living elsewhere can listen to, so we can guarantee the execution flow. And that way user output is not all muddled up, and et cetera. So these are the 2 ones we're doing. We're doing pre-install verify version and verify signature, which is where the signing actually happens. So if we look at that, this is in a separate plugin, our trust plugin. And so again, we're listening for the verify signature. And then down there, you'll see we're actually doing the install code signing verification, which will prompt the user if it's not signed. And if the user says, no, I don't want to install it, it will go into that catch block and we'll print out the error to the user and stop the CLI execution flow so that the plugin is not actually installed or none of that plugin code is ever ran. So a little bit about with performance. Again, we've been developing this thing for a few years. So our code bases are actually pretty big. We have 6 core plugins, not including anything with oclif that is shipped with the CLI. Our main plugin has over 70 contributors. I guess 90 commands was about right, but that's just in the one plugin. Over 800 source files, a few thousand tests, including integration and smoke. And then we bring in over 700 modules, NPM modules, and that's just at the top node module level. So, obviously when you start getting this big, there's a lot of performance concerns, especially when you're loading all of those node modules into memory every single time a command is executed. And so this kind of hints at some of the performance concerns that Jeff was mentioning. And so we do some additional things on top of oclif to help that out a little bit. So one thing we do is there's always been a big debate internally about module versions, carroting versus specifying an exact version of the node module. Some problems that you may run into is if you carrot and one of your dependencies updates a new version, and it's, even though it follows semver, it could technically still break. And so we've actually had a lot of customers say, oh, the CLI is broken, even though we never released anything because one of the dependencies broke something that we had. But if you hard code everything, that means that some other libraries that you're using, maybe they're using Lodash and we're using Lodash and you're not using carroting, now you're bringing in multiple versions of that node module into memory. And so there's been times where we've had 11 different versions of the same node package being loaded into memory every single time a command is executed. So you can see how quickly things spiral out of control. So just keep that in mind when you're incorporating more and more dependencies into your CLI. We actually do some lazy loading for node modules. So this is kind of a homegrown package that we have. It's right there. It's open source, so you can look at it. And what this does is it doesn't actually load the code into memory until you try to use it. And so it uses node proxies to do this. And it's really, really handy. If you're bringing in a massive library, but you're only using one class of that, this will actually help you quite a bit because you're not actually loading the entire thing into memory at once. We're just loading only that thing that is being used at the time it is being used. We also use compile cache. So Node just uses V8 behind the scenes, which uses a JIT compilation to turn the JavaScript code into bytecode. And so that happens every single time you run a command. And so by using the compile cache, it will actually compile those bytecodes or cache those bytecodes for you, so you're not doing it every single time. Windows support sad face. Node has historically had big performance problems on Windows in general, historically, but also file loading is a lot slower. So if you have over 700 modules, which could be tens of thousands of files, and you're loading those into memory every single time on Windows, it's pretty slow. And so just be aware of that, especially if the hardware of the Windows machine is not a solid state drive, it becomes even slower. And so these are, a lot of Salesforce users are Windows users, and so we really have to pay attention to Windows performance, even though it's still not that great for the Salesforce CLI. And then one more point on here, kind of not related to module loading, but over 85% of our commands make calls to the server. At least 27% of those are long running, meaning we enqueue something on the Salesforce servers, and it may not be done for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a day. And depending how you handle that on the command line can be a very bad user experience. So you should always be aware when you're making async requests, how long they take. And we do a lot of different kind of patterns on trying to make this feel better to the user. If you're curious on some of the things we do, come talk to me. Just for some quick performance numbers. CLI engine, which I kind of crossed out because it's not oclif, none of you guys will ever use it, but you can see it on average took 2 seconds to load the commands. One reason for that was because CLI engine actually loaded the entire plugin into memory every time you ran just one command. And so one thing we worked pretty heavily with Jeff and Felipe in oclif is to do individual command loading. So you may have noticed that when you run a command, it's actually only loading the command in that plugin and it's not loading the entire plugin. So that helped us out quite a bit. On average with oclif, we have 870 milliseconds per runtime. When you include the compile cache, we save about 100 or so milliseconds. Lazy loading, a couple hundred milliseconds. And when you add all this together, we're about 38% faster than just base oclif. So these are some things you can do. We have even more ideas on how we can improve this further. For example, Electron, if you've ever used that, they take a heap snapshot of the memory and store that, and they'll load that into memory rather than using Node's memory loader, right? And that can do, that makes it tremendously faster. VS Code, for example, loads up pretty fast, right? And that's a massive thing, and they're using those Electron heap snapshots. So there's even more we can do here, but these are just some of the things that we're starting to investigate to make a Node runtime even faster. So reliability. Kind of as I talked about, this one's more about expectations. So, if we were to release whenever we wanted or every single day, a lot of customers don't like that because they don't know when to expect things. If we change something, it could break them. Even if we don't think we're breaking them, we could break them. And so they really want to know when things are going to happen. So at Salesforce, we have a weekly release schedule. And so they know exactly when we're going to release, when to expect stuff. We follow semantic versioning, SEMVer. I'm assuming you guys all know what that is, but if you don't, highly recommend you follow it. Basically, it says you're only going to be doing breaking changes in a major version bump. And so that way, if someone is carroting, they won't pick up your breaking change. And so we kind of take that a little bit further because of the way the CLI correlates with the Salesforce core releases. So Salesforce will release every 4 months on the server where new features and stuff come out. And that's when the Salesforce server has a different API version change. So we'll go from, let's say, version 45 of the API to version 46 of the API. And there are a lot of times where there are new APIs or new parameters or whatever that are only in that API version. And so developers want to start developing against that API version, but so they can't be part of the weekly release, right? Because that version may not come out for another 2 months. So it kind of makes us have a more complicated branching strategy. We have a pre-release period where customers can test out the new version of Salesforce for a month or two before it's actually released. So we also have a CLI pre-release. So it's all kinds of stuff we have to do to make customers, expect what and use the CLI in a way that's meaningful with the Salesforce servers. In addition, we also have a deprecation policy. So even though we can have breaking changes in a major version, when we release the Salesforce CLI, let's say from 45 to 46, we can't break you unless we've given you deprecation warning messages for one major release. So we give you 4 months to update your CI scripts, your plugins, whatever it may be, so that way, major release doesn't come out. It's like, oh, sorry, we're going to break you, and you have to update everything. And then, of course, support for Windows, Mac, and Ubuntu. Another thing in reliability is we have really big builds. A lot of this is historical. When I showed you the history of the CLI, our builds have been evolving for a really long time. So we have both internal and external environments, and what we do is on Monday, we cut the code branches, we publish everything internally so that people can play around with it, and then on Thursday, we promote the stuff internally to go public. And so to do that, we're using NPM, we're using a Verdaccio server internally. We have our Git. We both have our Salesforce has our public Git as well as an internal Git server. For S3, we host all of our build artifacts on S3, and so we use an internal. We use the Minio library to host an internal one so that we can test all of our publishes S3. We use Jenkins for everything. This may be more information than you guys care about on builds, but I think it's pretty interesting because the stuff evolves pretty quickly. So we have a single publish and promote button. So really on Monday, our DevOps guy just pushes one button, and it will publish all of our core plugins and the CLI, build all of the artifacts, the installers, everything, and push all that internally. And then on Thursday, once all the testing is good, he'll only push another button, and it will promote all that stuff, all the plugins, everything out to public. So yeah, over 25 build scripts, 129 DSL libraries. Again, probably more information than you guys really care about, but our builds are pretty intensive, and so if you guys have any questions about building your CLIs, come talk to me. Now, standardization, I think this one's big. I mentioned this is really, when you have a large organization, I think there's TMP at Salesforce is over 13,000 employees. So that's a big organization. A lot of times teams don't really talk with each other. So you have to kind of enforce that things are done in a specific way. So we have team coding standards, all of our dev config, so TS config, linting rules, all that stuff is all open source public in this repo. And so we enforce that across all teams internally, and we also use it in our plugin generator. So as Jeff mentioned, we forked their generator so that people can just run SFDS plugins to generate a new plugin. And so we include all of this in there as well. If the community members who are building a plugin don't want to use it, they don't have to. But the benefit of this is internal and external plugins, the code feels similar, right? So you can quickly jump from one plugin to another plugin, and I think that's pretty powerful. Obviously, code reviews. For command consistency, we broke out a lot of things in our plugins into these core open source libraries. So this handles everything from encryption to authentication, including standard fields. So you'll see we have a built-in --JSON flag on every single command. And this is because we have so many people building on top of the existing commands. We even have tooling vendors who are building their tools with the CLI as a backbone. And so they need a more programmatical interface to the commands themselves, right? And if we change the terminal output of the command, it could break them. So we offer --JSON on every single command. And I'll kind of talk about a little bit about how we do that. That's in that @Salesforce command repo. We also do doc-ops. So, similar to man pages, doc-ops is another way of outputting CLI help. So we kind of use that for usage on all commands. Named Var Args. This is what I was talking about the difference between arguments and flags. So there are a lot of times where on the command line, we let you specify data to an API, and that can grow really, really big. But if you don't have that, no one's going to remember the order in which the arguments are specified. So we offer this thing called Var Args, which is an option you can enable on the base command that will set up the structure for you. So I can do, email equals my email, name equals my name, and they can string these things together, and we know how to handle that in the command a little bit easier. Let's see, we control the core plugin, so in order to be part of the core Salesforce CLI release, you have to follow all this stuff. We also have a huge document on how to name commands. Naming is very difficult, and so you really want to know that all the commands, again, feel similar. So we have a huge naming guide, a flag naming guide, like all of these things are kind of controlled by a review board. So anytime you want to be signed or you want to be part of the core plugin list, it goes through a review board so that we can make sure everything is consistent across the entire CLI. Also, one thing I want to point on too is that all of our help messages are extracted out into JSON files. And so this really helps our doc writers can review all of our messages in a single file without having to go look at the code. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit too. We currently do not localize the CLI, but it is structured in a way where you could easily localize it. Yeah, we haven't had a huge need to localize the CLI, but we could, yeah. So that @Salesforce/command library has the SFDX command. So when you generate a Salesforce CLI plugin, we kind of require all commands implement this rather than the oclif command. And the reason why we do that is to, again, add on these standard flags. As you heard Jeff mention, there's not a great way to do this in oclif right now, and we didn't want to require all of the plugin developers to do the spread operator to add in the base commands, because what if they forget? Now there's no --JSON flag, and that's kind of something we don't want to happen. So what we did is we overloaded the flags property into a getter method, and here you can see we're actually building our SFDX flags using this .flags config. So instead of our plugin developers having an object on the flags property, we require them to use the flags config property. So just a little bit different syntax, if you will, or not, just a different name. But this way we can control the flag property that oclif reads. We also offer some additional static properties on the command, like this supports the username. And what that does is it will dynamically add the fields to the command so that, again, things are standard, right? When you want to target a Salesforce org, the flag is --u or --target username. And we want that to be standard across anything that interacts with the Salesforce org. So to do that, we have the static property called this supports username. We generate that during this build SFDX flag help if they want that. And then also what that does is it adds on this.org to the command instance. So that way in my run method, I can just say this.org.getConnection.query, and I don't have to worry about setting that up myself. So those are some of the things we did. I showed an example down on the bottom of an org open command, which has the required username equals true, has the flags config, which it looks exactly to what you guys are used to, but it's just a different name of the flag property. We also override the flags object in oclif. And the reason why we do this is we want more built-in types. So we have a flag type for email, for instance URL, for folder. So there's all these different types that we support out of the box in addition to the oclif standard types like string and boolean and whatnot. And then here you'll see our messages.getMessages. And that's what I was talking about, how all the messages live in a JSON file, and then this will load them into the help. All right, so just to recap, everything you saw here was in addition to what oclif provides. So these are all things that we did specifically to kind of enhance some of those values that I mentioned. We have a lot of open source libraries as well. So we're trying to constantly get more and more of the Salesforce. The whole Salesforce CLI is not open source yet, but we're trying to push for that. But a lot of the things that I kind of mentioned, the messages, signing, encryption, a lot of that is already open sourced. And so another question is, do they belong in oclif? So for example, plugin signing. I know Heroku said that could be interesting to them as well. Maybe you guys want to sign plugins too. right? And so if that was in the oclif namespace or the org in GitHub, that could be beneficial to a lot more people. Maybe it'd be beneficial to add that messaging framework into oclif so that you guys can utilize and not have to build your own. So I'd be curious to hear from you guys maybe afterwards, like what are the things that are important to you? And that could help drive some of our requirements and how we pull this stuff into the oclif open source list to make it easier for you guys to develop CLIs. And then one other thing is just always think about enterprise grade. I know there's a lot of companies here, and so it's going to be different for what it is for your customers, or whether customers are internal or external, right? Whether you're building CLIs just internally or whether you're trying to have your customers use them, always think about what it means for trust. Yeah, that's it. I don't know if I have a lot of time for Q&A, but I'll be on the panel later too, so you can always ask questions then as well. Or ask me individually, but yeah, that's it.
You got a question back there,
Sure.
Thomas? Hey, this is Ben from Twilio. I was curious how you think about, you said 16,000 users. How do you count them? And how do you grow that number? Why do people adopt the CLI?
Yeah. What was the first question? Did you ask how we count them?
Yeah. How do you know 16,000? And how do you count repeat usage? How do you think about your users?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, like I said, we have kind of our own analytics thing similar to Heroku. And so, we even mentioned having like a core analytics plugin for oclif would be interesting. How we count our users are the authentication. So when you connect to an org, that's how we know it's an actual Salesforce user, and we count that. So if people actually download the CLI but they never connect to an org, we don't know about them. And I don't want to sound mean, but we honestly don't really care, right? We really want we want the users who are actually integrating and interacting with the Salesforce org. So that's how we do our user count. I think at Trailhead they just said there's like 9 million developers on the Salesforce platform, something like that. That's also citizen developers who are doing like click-in, more like low-code type stuff, but still it's a big number, and we're only 16,000. So luckily we are seeing that usage go up quite a bit. But yeah, I'm not, Claire, our product manager, is here somewhere. She can maybe talk about adoption a little bit more, but that's just about how we count them, yeah.
That was helpful. How do you support them, right? Especially with all the different environments?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that is heavily debated still today. So obviously if you're a Salesforce user, depending on your licenses, you can open support tickets with Salesforce. And so that is kind of the number one way, because if they open up a support ticket, that will get an investigation to the dev team. And then we kind of have SLAs around that, right? Service level agreements where we have to respond in a certain number of time and all that. Not everyone has the licenses that can actually file a support ticket. So we also have a success community where a lot of customers, again, you kind of need a Salesforce username to be part of that success community, but they can post questions on there, and not only will the community respond, so it's kind of like a Stack Exchange, but on Chatter. And so the community will respond, but also all of the product managers monitor that, and so they'll respond to that. The engineers can participate, so I've been very heavily involved in that group as well. Another channel is GitHub. And so since we're open sourcing more and more of it, we get a lot of people who are asking questions on the GitHub issues. One problem though is because we have over 70 contributors, a lot of teams that don't monitor that. And so we'll get someone someone will post on the core repo, which is about authentication and encryption. That's why doesn't source push work, which is just a random command, right? And it's like, well, you're really asking the question on the wrong repo. So one thing the product management team is experimenting with is they're having an issues only repo on GitHub. And so they're kind of directing all questions and problems there. And the product management team is also monitoring that and responding, and then converting those to issues in our internal tracker. So those are some of the things we're doing. Yeah, good.
So Thomas mentioned something that made me realize I really wanted to clarify. Not clarify, but add to. When SFTX was building oclif, they had a ton of breaking changes that we caused because we were incessant to have a very good framework. Those breaking changes were really painful and really hurt development. But starting with the release of oclif, we're really committed to not having any breaking changes from now on. Breaking changes can be useful sometimes. So I think we need to formalize this and put it on the website, and we haven't done that yet. I'm realizing now we should. What I would like to do is tie breaking changes around Node LTS releases. So the next one that we'll have to deprecate, Node 8, will be in April of next year. And I think that might be a good opportunity for us to get rid of any usages that we don't like and add very small breaking changes if we think it's necessary. Right now, I don't even think anything would fall into that. So, a lot of you guys are at big companies that want to use oclif, and I just want to assure you that breaking changes are something we take very seriously and we're not going to include from now on.
Good clarification. Anything else? The question was, is the deck available to download? Not right now, but I can make it available. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like that
Okay.
deck as well. It was a really good talk. That disparity between 9 million and 16,000 was a big surprise to me. And obviously, it's an investment for your super power users. So obviously, the ratio doesn't really matter that much. I was just wondering how duplicative it feels to do something in the web UI, right? And then having to duplicate that. Like, is it essentially a double engineering effort every time, or is there some way to resolve that? Because I have that exact problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of times that duplication does feel a little frustrating. Some commands in the CLI are literally just API wrappers. And so there's really not that much duplication. It's literally they expose in the API, and then we'll wrap that so that it's easier to use and people can use the same authentication method that we do without having to figure out how to connect to the org so they can use that API in a more development sort of way. To answer that a little bit different too, Salesforce has a lot of weird APIs as well. I would say that Salesforce APIs are definitely not the best or the cleanest that I've seen. If any of you have used it, you probably know that. And so a lot of things that we're doing in the CLI too is to try to massage them a little bit so that it feels a little bit of a better user experience. So that doesn't feel like that much of a duplication effort because Salesforce servers have a way more restrictive deprecation policy. In fact, we still support all the API versions. So no matter if you're using API version 10, it's still technically supported. And so it's really challenging to do huge refactors of the APIs. And so kind of the CLI is a good use to help make the developer experience better without worrying about making those core changes. One other thing that we're kind of doing is I mentioned that we're starting to use the CLI as the backbone of a lot of tooling. And so I don't really think of it so much as duplication between the server and the CLI. I want to just make sure we're not doing duplication between the CLI and other tools. So we have VS Code extensions that are purely used in the CLI for almost everything. And so that way the UI in VS Code extensions is really just using the CLI for all the heavy lifting. Salesforce has a lot of third-party developer, like tooling vendors. They're also building on top of the CLI. So when we make improvements there, it trickles around to the entire tooling ecosystem. And so that's kind of how I think about it. I think of it as the CLI as the really, so I think it's important to get that right as well, right? So the CLI is kind of the backbone of a lot of tooling that you're going to have at your company. And so think of it to start there rather than think of it as duplication from the server.